As European nations moved through the medieval world toward modern Europe, the changes that came about were frequently slow in coming and attended by issues that required time for resolution. We talked about the impact of the Crusades, which opened up an interest in trade, helped lead to urbanization, the beginnings of a middle class, and migration of peasants from the land that they were on to the new cities. The problem is that in those new cities there were few jobs, and the number of peasants that were no longer working manors meant that there was a decrease in food supply, and so the things weren't just wonderful in the response to the Crusades. Even more to the point, what happens on the manors is that peasants each had a plot of land that was theirs to grow their own food on, in addition to working the land of the owners. But the problem is, if the peasant had 2 or 3 sons, he would then divide his land among them when he died. And as that happens over centuries, you get to the point where for most peasants, there's not enough land that they own to take care of themselves. Now, the late 13th century was a time of good weather, and the ability to raise crops had been adequate for the growing population that Europe had. But in the second decade of the 1300s, we run into a period called the Little Ice Age. Little Ice Age was a time when lots of rain, lots of severe storms, cooler weather, and all of that together creates a shorter growing season. So when you take the decrease in the amount of land that each peasant has, the shorter growing season, and the fact that there are now more people living in urban areas who do not raise their own food and are dependent upon peasants to produce for them, we run into famine in an awful lot of areas. The so-called Great Famine, the period 1315 to 1317, estimates are as high as that as many as 10% of the population of Europe died of starvation. So there are good times and bad times, and not, we don't move forward on a necessarily on an even keel. Other problems arose, however, primarily in the area of politics. Europe had laws called Primogenitor and Entail. Primogenitor said that the oldest son inherited everything from his father. He inherited the titles, he inherited the land, he inherited all of the serfs who worked for him. And of course, second and third sons had to be taken care of. You could buy them a position in the army. You could marry them off to somebody who didn't have any sons but had a lot of land, and therefore they were going to come to the daughters. But theoretically, primogeniture meant that the son of the king should be the next king. He ought to inherit the title. But the problem is the succession to the throne in most European states was frequently confused over a number of claimants, and claims when the king died frequently resulted in upheaval over the question of who was to be the next king. You have generally a number of people who have some claim to the throne, and frequently the claimants to the throne weren't all from the same country. Intermarriage among royal families meant that frequently people from, say, England would have claim to land in France, and consequently, England controls by the mid 1300s major chunks of modern day France. Obviously, when William of Normandy came to become King of England in 1066, he didn't cease being the Duke of Normandy. He still claimed that land as his. And by a series of dynastic marriages over time, the English kings claimed or could claim much of the southwestern part of France. And so beginning in 1337, the two nations go to war, not constantly. It's called the 100 Years' War, and it will last just exactly that amount of time. That the French are fighting to get their land away from the English. The English are fighting to keep the land. If you read the history plays of Shakespeare, you know that Henry IV, parts 1 and 2, and Henry V deal specifically with that. It is Henry V that fights the Battle of Agincourt in 1415. Where the longbow is introduced for the first time. And in the Battle of Agincourt, there are 6,000 French casualties and 400 English casualties, because the French were limited to the crossbow, which was more powerful, more deadly, in fact, but you had to be right up in front of a person for it to be effective. The longbow could rain arrows down from a long distance, and that was what Henry V did. But the problem for the English is you got to pay for these wars. The 100 Years' War, by the time you go from 1337 into the last part of the 14th century, the cost has begun to grow. And so in 1381, the English faced what was called the Peasants' Revolt. The problem is that the king, Richard II, in order to pay for his wars against the French, raised the taxes of the peasants, and the peasants would have none of it. When in 1381 he announces a poll tax on everybody in the area, particularly the area around Norwich, which was to the north and slightly to the east of London. They rose up in revolt. They actually attacked London successfully. Richard hides out in the Tower. A number of his royal advisors are put to death. He makes a deal with the peasants that send them back home, and then he reneges on the deal and brings his armies out and kills off a number of the people that might have been a number of the peasants, and reestablishes control over England. But all of that is again a matter of upheaval. And so you've got dynastic problems. You've got the 100 Years' War, and even in the church, the most stable of all social institutions, the 14th century is where we begin to see some of those issues that would ultimately result in the Protestant Reformation in the early 16th century. One example, there was, but because England was separated from the mainland, Churchill said that England was in Europe but not of Europe, and so even in an area that is as stable as comparatively as England was, there's constant battles. They're fighting the Scots. They're fighting the Welsh. Where should the boundaries be? There are battles for secession in England. We know of the War of the Roses, where the houses of York and the houses of Lancaster will battle over who has the right of secession, until finally Henry Bolingbroke, who becomes Henry IV, ends the Wars of the Roses and establishes the House of Tudor, which brings some degree of stability to England. But it's in England that one of the first great demands for church reform comes. John Wycliffe, who lives from 1328 to 1384, was an Oxford Don, a leader and teacher in the Oxford community, who begins to demand changes in Christian life. He argues that if it's not specifically in the Bible, it was not necessarily required for Christians to follow. For that reason, Wycliffe rejects pilgrimages. We know pilgrimages. I mean, we all read the Canterbury Tales when we were in high school, and we know that the Canterbury Tales is a pilgrimage to Canterbury to get some of the blood of the slain archbishop. But Wycliffe rejects that. We don't do this. He also argues that worship of the saints was tantamount to idol worship, and therefore he rejected that. He disagreed with the church by arguing in favor of let me get this right here, make sure I say this correctly, consubstantiation, as opposed to the church argument in favor of transubstantiation. And perhaps the place where Wycliffe made himself most a thorn in the side of the church was that he believed that everybody ought to have the right to read the Bible in his own language. And in a world where the Bible had been in Latin and nothing else, and where it was not in the vernacular, the common people could, regardless of how educated they were in their own language, were unable to read the Bible. And so he began to work on a translation of the Bible into English. His followers, people called the Lollards, also not only created problems in England, but they inspired a Bohemian reformer by the name of John Huss, who began to argue for similar reforms on the continent. Now, this is 100 years before Martin Luther tacks his thesis onto the cathedral door in Wittenberg, if indeed, we never know, if indeed Luther actually tacked his thesis on the door of the cathedral. But the issue is already being over the power of the church is already being waged. The great English historian Lord Acton in the late 19th century, one of the first to bring history writing into the modern world by paying attention to sources, by using what we would call footnotes and references. Lord Acton said, all power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Well, there's not an institution more absolute in its power than the church. And the church doesn't like, they don't like Huss, they don't like the Lollards. They eventually, at the Council of Constance in 1415, condemn Huss as a heretic and burn him at the stake. And of course, by 1415, Wycliffe's been dead for 31 years, but they go back, they exhume his body, and they burn his bones. That's how anxious they were to eliminate what they considered to be heretical activity. But all of this leads to confusion. The late medieval ages, or the early modern years, depending on how you look at this, are not smooth times. There's confusion within the church. There's problems of making the agriculture work. There are problems of secession. We know Europe that may be confused, but at least there's elements of stability. There were remarkably few elements of stability in the first part of the 14th, last part of the 14th, first part of the 15th century. But in this time period, perhaps the greatest single, most significant, if you like, social event of the late Middle Ages was the so-called Black Death. Undoubtedly, in terms of percentages killed rather than numbers killed, we always have to bear that in mind. The Spanish influenza of 1919, 1920 probably killed more people than the Black Death. But the population of Europe was so much greater by the 20th century than it was in the 14th century that in terms of percentage, the Black Death was the most virulent of all pandemics in world history. Ironically, given what we are facing with COVID-19 today, the Black Death probably came out of southwestern China. The area was controlled by the Mongols, and the Mongols eventually moved into the heart of China, and they brought stability, if you like, political stability to China, and they brought it to most of Asia. But the problem is they brought the plague with them. There was one province in China outside of Beijing where in the aftermath of the Mongol takeover, 90% of the people died. And in the whole of China, the estimation is that the Chinese population by 1400 had declined from 120 million to 80 million. 40 million people who died in China as a result of the plague. The Mongols, of course, the other, they brought stability, stability that was accompanied by death, but they brought stability. And one of the things they did was they opened up the Silk Road to trade and travel. And so that there was a renaissance, if you like, of trade making its way from China to the Mediterranean. And of course, the problem is as the caravan routes moved west, the plague moved with them. Now, the plague was, most historians will argue that it was either the bubonic plague or the bubonic plague was a major part of the Black Death. There are some deaths where the people saw their respiratory systems attacked, and that is atypical of the bubonic plague. That's not the way the bubonic plague worked. One of my sources said that it was possible that anthrax might have been a part of the Black Death. But generally, everybody seems to be in agreement that the plague was spread by fleas who hiked, if you like, on board black rats. And these rats accompanied the caravans as they headed to the west. And of course, once they got to the west, they jumped on board the trading ships. And it's interesting to look at when the plague arrived where, because you can almost see that, well, a ship who left this place, this port at this time, would have arrived in another country at a specific time. And so you can watch the plague make its way from the Mediterranean steadily to the north. By 1346, the plague had arrived in Kaffa, a city in the Crimea on the Black Sea. It was kind of the end stop, if you like, of the Silk Road. And it was the point at which products would then be moved to ships to make their way through the Mediterranean. The Genoese get the blame for bringing the plague to Europe. It had arrived in Constantinople by 1347. And by October of 1347, it made its way to Europe for the first time when a Genoese ship stopped in the island of Sicily. And apparently enough of the black rats de-embarked from the ship there. And the plague now suddenly begins to run all over Sicily. From there, by the end of 47, it had arrived in southern France, in southern Italy, in southern Spain. By 1348, it had arrived in the Low Countries, Germany and England. The next year, it made its way to Scandinavia. And by 1351, it had appeared in Russia. Although interestingly, the plague in Russia and areas in the eastern part of Central Europe was much less virulent than it was in the West. Major symptoms from the plague, from the Black Death, seem to have been high fever, aching joints, swelling lymph nodes, and dark blotches caused by bleeding under the skin. Now, we don't understand COVID-19 completely, but we are inundated by our medical experts on television news with explanations of what to look for, where the problem is, where the symptoms are. We have respirators and we have all kinds of things. There are stories of people that were on respirators for 30 some odd days and yet managed to survive. In a more primitive medical world, which the late medieval ages were, that kind of assistance is really not there. There is a monastery in Baume in France that literally was designed as a hospital ward, but it was a hospital ward where they expected everybody to die. You could go there and you could die in dignity, as opposed to just facing what you would have to face in your small building. The estimates are that 50 to 60% of the people who contracted the Black Death died from it between 1347 and 1350. Historians estimate that the population in Great Britain declined by 25 to 50%. And again, like most pandemics, and we're being warned of this right now with COVID-19, it doesn't just come and stop. It keeps coming back and coming back and coming back. The major ages of the first attack of the Black Death were 1348 to 1350, but it reappears in 1361-62. It reappeared again then in 1369, and then in Great Britain it reappears periodically every 5 or 10 years until the end of the 15th century. And it would take almost to the end of the 17th century the population of England and Europe to recover to its pre-pandemic times. So the Black Death took an incredible physical toll on the population, but it also took, perhaps even more astoundingly, well, not more astoundingly, but more devastatingly, a psychological impact. Medical science at the time was limited pretty much to bleeding somebody, you know, even as late as 1799, when George Washington contracted his last disease. He dies on December the 14th. But he's bled 3 or 4 times. The feeling was you cut somebody open and let the blood out, and the hope was that as the blood left, it carried whatever the disease was out with it. But obviously, one of the problems, and that's probably true for what happened to President Washington, you overbleed somebody, and if they're already sick and you take enough blood out of their system, they are unable to battle against whatever it is that has made them ill. And so bleeding was used to try to contract the Black Death, but people were unwilling to come too close to the bodies for fear they'd get them themselves. There is of course, we all know the story of the Pied Piper of Hamelin, and the Pied Piper was going to lead the rats out of the city. Well, again, people were smart enough to understand that it was the rats that were the problem. And so the story of the Pied Piper is the story of this vain hope that we can get rid of the Black Death by getting the Pied Piper to lead the rats away. And so there's very little that can happen. You know, there's the people who are paid money to come around in the evenings and carry off all the dead bodies. You take the dead bodies out, you burn them, because again, you don't know what it is in them that's going to affect you. And people are increasingly unable or unwilling to deal with each other. Community begins to collapse. Most people saw the plague as God's punishment for us because we've sinned against God's law. Some people seem to take a live for the moment attitude. We're going to die, so eat, drink, and be merry. Why? It doesn't matter. We don't need to worry about it. It's going to happen anyway. Let's have a good time. Let one last party before we go. Some people decided that maybe flagellation was the answer. Beat ourselves and beat others in the hopes that the physical damage we achieve on ourselves and each other will appease God, and maybe He will have mercy on God's people. Some went so far as to feel like the Black Death was the end of the world. You know, this is how it's going to end. You know, this is the final judgment, that the Black Death is going to end civilization as we know it. Unfortunately, one of the things that seems to always arise when there are issues in world history is there is a sense in Christian communities of anti-Semitism, blaming much of what happens on the Jews. Jews were blamed for poisoning water wells to inflict the disease on Christians. And consequently, there are a whole series of pogroms all over Europe and all over England that result from the sense of the Christians that we got to make the Jews pay for this happening. Now, if you want if you want to look at a possible bright side to the pandemic, it killed off enough people that it eliminated the famine problem. We don't have to worry about there not being enough food. There's plenty of food left because we have so many fewer people. And in actual point of fact, the diet of the average peasant in England and in Europe begins to improve fairly dramatically. And that helps with the rebuilding of the population until the next wave of the pandemic comes. So this is the world in which Julian of Norwich lived. It's a world where people don't understand a lot of things about what's going on. It's a world where there is it's difficult to trust your neighbor or trust anybody else other than yourselves. It's a world that where people need some security. They need. We talked about the monasteries providing stability. Julian never entered a monastery. She was what was called an anchorite. An anchorite is one who withdraws from the world, not in a community, but almost as a hermit, devoting herself to a life of prayer. She lived her entire adult life in a cell that was attached to St. Julian's Church, which is where Julian of Norwich's name comes from. She was a mystic. She saw visions, and she wrote about her visions to. She was one of the more prolific female writers of the era. She looked at the world differently because she saw God differently than most people. In fact, she wrote the oldest surviving book in English written by a woman. Now, all of her writings were anonymous, but they were carefully kept by some Benedictine nuns. And eventually, they weren't published till 1670 because the upheaval of the Reformation and the upheaval of English religion prevented it from happening until then. But other than that, very little is known of her life. And in fact, we don't even know what her name was. She's Julian of Norwich, but obviously she's not Julian. It's clear, though, she's mentioned in 4 different wills that have survived. People who praise her for offering advice, offering comfort, offering sustenance at difficult times. And so she obviously, even though she had removed herself from the normal life of the community, she nevertheless played an important part at a time when people needed support wherever they could get it. She obviously was one of the people in Norwich that supported those who were dealing with a revolt, dealing with a pandemic, dealing with a world that increasingly seemed to make no sense.